sun sank over Alexandria like a dying ember, its glow bleeding into the sea. Smoke curled above the marble rooftops, carrying the scent of ash, myrrh, and fear. The once radiant city, jewel of the Nile, crown of the East, now trembled beneath the boots of foreign legions. From the palace balcony, Cleopatra watched the horizon flicker as if the gods themselves were turning away. Inside, silence had a pulse. The corridors that once rang with music and laughter now whispered with betrayal. Courtiers who once vowed loyalty had vanished. The guards stood motionless, their eyes heavy with the knowledge that the end had already arrived. The grand tapestries swayed in the night breeze, torn and dust-covered, like ghosts of a vanished empire. Cleopatra moved through her palace with the stillness of a statue carved from grief and gold. Her jewels no longer shone. They weighed upon her like chains. She paused by the great mirror of obsidian that once reflected triumph. Now it showed a woman stripped of illusions. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from resolve. From beyond the gates, faint cries rose, the city breaking under Rome's iron grip. Every sound was a requiem, the shatter of pottery, the chant of soldiers, the roar of fire consuming the harbor. Alexandria, her masterpiece, was dying. At the center of her chamber stood a single unlit candle. Cleopatra reached for it, her fingers brushing the wax like a farewell. She struck flint to flame, and the room came alive in trembling gold. Shadows danced along the walls, the faces of her ancestors, the lovers she had lost, the gods who had turned silent. She did not light it to pray. She lit it to choose, to decide what would remain hers when all else was taken, her throne, her kingdom, her life. In that fragile flame, Cleopatra saw the truth. Empires could be conquered, but legends could not. And as the last candle of Alexandria burned, the Queen of the Nile prepared to write her own ending. The morning after came without light. A gray sun rose over the harbor, filtered through smoke and the cries of the dying. From the highest tower of the palace, Cleopatra looked upon a sight that once would have seemed impossible: the eagle banners of Rome, casting their shadows over the shores of Egypt. Octavian's legions had arrived like a storm that never ended. Ships covered the sea like scales of an iron serpent, their masts crowned with crimson sails. The sand beneath them trembled with the weight of conquest. Each sound, the clash of shields, the bark of orders in Latin, carried the echo of a world-ending dot. Cleopatra stood unmoving, wrapped in robes of deep indigo, her face carved from the stillness of marble. She knew this day would come. The stars had whispered it long ago. The gods had been silent for too long, and silence, she had learned, was an omen. A messenger arrived, trembling, kneeling before her throne. Octavian's words were few and cruel. Surrender, and Rome will spare your children. No threats, no promises, just the cold precision of victory. She dismissed him with a wave of her hand, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Rome does not spare, she murmured, more to herself than to him. It collects. Around her, courtiers whispered prayers to forgotten gods. Some begged her to flee south into the desert, others to negotiate. But Cleopatra knew there was no escape, no bargain worth her crown. The moment she bowed, Egypt would die, not in battle, but in memory. As the day waned, she turned once more toward the sea. The Roman fleet glimmered like a wall of polished bronze. Somewhere beyond it, Octavian waited, young, ruthless, patient. And in that moment, Cleopatra understood that her final war would not be fought with armies, but with choice, with image, with legend. The empire was at her door, but before she opened it, she would make sure her name entered with her, not as a prisoner, but as a queen who chose her fate. The palace had become a mausoleum of memories. Incense still burned in the halls, but its sweetness could not mask the scent of death that lingered in the air. Cleopatra walked through the corridors like a ghost visiting her own tomb. Her golden sandals, brushing against fallen petals that once marked royal celebrations. In the center of her private chamber lay Mark Antony, the man who once made Rome tremble, her lover, her general. Her mirror in ambition now lay pale upon silken sheets, the light gone from his eyes. His armor, dented and bloodstained, glimmered faintly in the lamplight. Cleopatra knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she traced the lines of his face. Once, those same hands had drawn battle plans across maps of empires. Now they searched only for warmth that was no longer there. She whispered his name, not as a queen commanding a soldier, but as a woman calling to the only heart that ever beat beside her own. Outside, the Roman horns sounded again, a cruel reminder that even love could not stop an empire. The echoes reached her through the marble walls. Breaking the fragile stillness of her grief, she leaned closer, pressing her forehead to Antony's, her voice low and steady. Rome will write of your defeat, but I will make sure it remembers your defiance. Tears did not fall. Queens, she had learned, are not granted that luxury. Instead, she closed his eyes with the same care one closes a sacred text. Around her, the air seemed to tighten, the universe itself holding its breath as the moon rose. She ordered his body wrapped in imperial linen and placed in the Hall of Victory, not for Rome but for him. The torches flickered as if bowing their heads. Cleopatra stood over him one last time, her shadow merging with his. The serpent had lost her soldier, but in her silence, something ancient stirred, a cold, steady resolve. the kind that does not seek mercy, only meaning. By the third night, the palace no longer belonged to Cleopatra, it belonged to whispers. The marble halls, once filled with philosophers, generals, and poets, now carried only the murmurs of servants and spies. Each echo told a different story. Some claimed the queen had gone mad. Others swore she had struck a secret bargain with the gods themselves. Rome's envoys moved like shadows through her corridors, weighing every glance, every silence, every flicker of defiance in her eyes. Octavian's men wanted her alive, a living trophy to parade through the streets of Rome. But those who knew Cleopatra understood. She would rather be myth than captive. Behind locked doors, the queen began to weave her final act. She summoned Apollodorus, her most loyal servant, under the guise of prayer. The chamber was lit only by oil lamps, their smoke curling like question marks in the air. On the marble table between them lay a sealed scroll and a small ivory chest engraved with coiled serpents, symbols of life, death, and eternity. No one knew what was inside. Some said it was poison. Others believed it carried jewels meant to bribe Octavian's officers. But those closest to her swore she whispered to it, as if it were alive. Rumors spread like wildfire across Alexandria. A priest claimed he saw her entering the old temple of Isis by night, carrying offerings wrapped in linen. A Roman guard boasted that she had smiled at him with the calm of a woman who had already chosen her fate. Each tale contradicted the last. Yet every version shared one truth. Cleopatra was preparing for something no empire could control. Outside her chamber, the marble statues of forgotten gods seemed to watch in silence, their stone faces illuminated by trembling firelight. The queen walked past them slowly, her veil brushing the floor, her eyes unreadable. In those corridors of rumor and reflection, history blurred into legend, and behind the marble walls, the Queen of Egypt began her most dangerous rebellion, the one written not in blood or battle, but in silence and secrecy. The hour was late, too late for hope, yet too early for surrender. The palace had fallen into a haunting quiet, as if even the gods held their breath. Cleopatra stood in her private chamber, the heart of her kingdom's final night. Around her, the air shimmered with the scent of lotus and oil. Perfumed smoke rose in ribbons toward the ceiling, veiling the moonlight that spilled through the latticed windows. She was dressed in white linen, embroidered with gold thread, the same garments worn by the goddess Isis. Her crown rested beside her, not upon her head. She no longer needed it. The time for rule had ended. The time for remembrance had begun. At her feet lay the ivory chest, its carvings glinting like coiled fire. She touched it gently, whispering a prayer older than Rome itself. The sound of distant waves carried through the chamber, mingling with the faint hum of cicadas beyond the walls. The world outside was breaking, but inside this room, Cleopatra's calm was absolute. Her two attendants, Iris and Charmian, stood beside her, loyal to the end. They exchanged a glance heavy with understanding. The queen had made her choice, and they would follow her into legend. When Cleopatra lifted the lid, the asp stirred a ripple of living shadow. Its scales shimmered like polished bronze, its eyes black as prophecy. She did not flinch. Instead, she extended her hand as if greeting an old friend. "Rome will not have me," she said softly. "Let them celebrate their victory. I will write my own." The serpent struck quickly, a flash of motion and silence. Cleopatra exhaled, her breath shallow, serene. She reclined upon her golden couch, her face radiant. Her lips curved in something between defiance and peace. As the venom coursed through her veins, the Queen of the Nile smiled, not in pain, but in triumph. For in that moment she belonged to no empire, no man, no god. The asp had not killed her. It had delivered her from history into eternity. Dawn crept slowly over Alexandria, pale, hesitant, uncertain of what world it was about to reveal. The sea was calm now, its waves whispering against the marble docks where Roman banners fluttered triumphantly. But inside the palace, time had stopped. Octavian's soldiers entered the queen's chamber with caution, swords drawn, though the silence held no threat. The air was heavy with perfume and death, a sweetness so strange it unsettled even the most hardened among them. The torches flickered, revealing what words would later fail to describe. Cleopatra lay upon her golden couch, draped in white and gold, her beauty untouched by decay. Her arm rested loosely at her side, the mark of the asp barely visible against her skin. Iris and Charmian lay near her feet, their final breaths offered in loyalty, their faces calm as if sleeping beside their queen. One soldier crossed himself, another whispered that she looked more divine than mortal. Even in death, she commanded the room. Octavian himself entered moments later. His sandals clicked softly on the marble floor, echoing through the vast chamber. For a brief instant, he hesitated, the conqueror before the conquered. This was not the trophy he had imagined parading through the streets of Rome. This was the end of an age. "Bury her with honors," he ordered, his voice low. "Let it be said that Rome defeated Egypt, but never her queen." Outside, the banners of Egypt were lowered for the last time. The people gathered in silence as the royal guards carried her body through the courtyard. The sun caught the edge of her funeral bier, turning the gold to fire. As the gates of the tomb closed, a final gust of wind swept through the corridors, extinguishing the remaining torches. The crown of Egypt lay upon the floor, untouched, glinting faintly in the darkness, the last echo of a reign that refused to be forgotten. The empire had claimed her land, her riches, her monuments, but not her story. That Cleopatra had taken with her into the silence where legends are born. The queen was gone, but her story refused to die. Before the tomb's incense had faded, rumors began to slither across the empire like the serpent that had ended her life. In Rome, poets sharpened their pens while generals toasted victory, yet beneath every celebration lay an unease. No triumph could silence the sense that Cleopatra had chosen her death, and in doing so, stolen Rome's glory. Octavian's scribes rewrote the ending swiftly. They painted her not as a sovereign who defied conquest, but as a seductress who drowned her empire in vanity. Scrolls and speeches described her as the witch of the Nile, the foreign temptress who bewitched noblemen and brought empires to ruin. In their ink, her crown became a curse, her love a weapon, her death a warning. But in Egypt, the story was whispered differently. The priests of Isis spoke her name with reverence. They told of a queen who, when faced with humiliation, turned her final breath into an act of divine rebellion. Her death, they said, was not suicide, it was ascension. She had not fallen to the abyss, she had risen through it, returning to the gods as the living embodiment of Isis herself. Two Cleopatras emerged from that single night, one of Roman hatred, one of Egyptian worship. Between them, truth dissolved into legend. Centuries passed, and her image drifted through mosaics, poems, and marble busts. Artists could never agree on her face. Some carved her as a goddess of beauty, others as a woman cloaked in sin. Yet in every version, her eyes held the same unyielding gaze, as if defying history itself. In the end, Cleopatra became what no empire could contain, a symbol, not merely of Egypt, but of power's final illusion that rulers may die, but their stories, once poisoned by myth, live forever. Her venom was not in the serpent's bite, it was in her legacy, a poison sweet enough to outlast Rome itself. Centuries have passed since the torchlight dimmed in Alexandria, yet Cleopatra's shadow still moves quiet, elegant, and undefeated. Her empire is dust, her tomb lost to time, but her name endures, carried like perfume through the corridors of history. Every age that follows finds her anew, shaping her in its own image, yet never fully capturing the truth of the woman who once ruled the Nile. In medieval Europe, she became the warning of desire, a queen punished for pride. In the Renaissance, she was reborn as art itself, draped in silk and sorrow, her death painted as beauty's final moment. To the Victorians she was scandal, too powerful, too sensual, too dangerous to fit inside their fragile notions of womanhood. And to the modern world, she is something else entirely, a voice that still asks the same question. How does a woman rule when history belongs to men who write it? Scholars search for her tomb, archaeologists dig beneath the sand, but what they seek is not stone, it is meaning. Cleopatra has transcended her empire, she has become its spirit. Her reflection lives in every story of power defied, in every act of quiet rebellion against the chains of conquest. Even Rome, her greatest enemy, could not silence her. Their marble crumbled, her legend did not. For every empire that rises, there comes a woman who remembers her, a figure who wears defiance as a crown and turns downfall into destiny. And so, the serpent's shadow stretches across time, coiling through art, politics, and memory, a symbol not of death, but of transformation. Cleopatra's life ended in a chamber of silence, but her presence still whispers through the ages. They took my kingdom, but I kept my story. For as long as the world remembers beauty entwined with power, love with ruin, and death with meaning, Cleopatra will never die. Her candle still burns in the ruins of Alexandria, flickering between truth and myth, between history and eternity. Time erases kings, cities, and monuments, but it cannot erase reflection. Cleopatra's face, once carved in gold and ivory, now survives not in temples, but in mirrors in the eyes of those who dare to question power, who refuse to be written by others. Her crown, once heavy with jewels, has become a symbol passed from one age to the next, the weight every woman bears when she chooses to define herself in the quiet halls of museums. Her image stares back from coins and statues. Tourists see beauty, historians see empire, but the truth lies somewhere in between, in the gaze that meets theirs, calm, unwavering, as if asking, "And what will you do with your story?" Cleopatra's life was more than seduction, more than tragedy. It was authorship. She wrote her own ending when the world tried to write it for her. She proved that even when power collapses, dignity can remain untouched, that sovereignty begins not in armies or crowns, but in choice. Every age remakes her because every age needs her. To the dreamers, she is courage. To the rulers, she is warning. To the silenced, she is voice. In the echo of her final night, humanity hears the eternal struggle between what is taken from us and what we refuse to surrender. Perhaps that is why her story still glows. Centuries later, like that final candle in the palace of Alexandria, the flame flickers, but it never dies. When you look into a mirror and see defiance in your own eyes, You are seeing her not as a queen of Egypt, but as the truth behind every empire's illusion that all crowns, no matter how golden, are borrowed. And when they fall, what remains is the only thing that ever belonged to her, the will to be remembered, not as a ruler or lover, but as a force. The mirror reflects us all, and in its depths, Cleopatra still waits, watching unbroken beneath the weight of eternity.